It's common to have subassemblies with moving parts. For example, a pneumatic cylinder extends and retracts to move other components. Inventor treats a subassembly like it's rigid, which means the positions of the subassembly components don't change. Although it causes problems for an assembly like a pneumatic cylinder, it's important for a couple of reasons. If a subassembly isn't rigid, the components can move unexpectedly when you make changes to the assembly. There's also a performance impact if a subassembly isn't rigid. When Inventor solves the assembly constraints, it can ignore the internal constraints of a rigid subassembly. For a flexible subassembly, Inventor has to solve the constraints that locate the subassembly and the constraints inside the subassembly. When you have hundreds or thousands of components in an assembly, you want to do everything possible to improve performance. Although rigid subassemblies are an advantage in most cases, it's a problem for something like a pneumatic cylinder because you need to change the length. This is usually frustrating for most new users, and they end up placing the components separately. While that allows the components to move, it takes more time and causes problems with the bill of materials because you buy the cylinder as a single component. The best way to resolve this issue is to make the subassembly flexible. This simple assembly has a pneumatic cylinder that moves a link. I have a constraint that sets the distance between the pivot points on the mounting base and the link. When I change the constraint value to 10 inches, a constraint error displays because Inventor can't change the length of the pneumatic cylinder. I'll click Accept in the error dialog. And then I'll right-click on the pneumatic cylinder and select Flexible. The length of the pneumatic cylinder updates, and I can change the constraint to different values. As I mentioned earlier, Flexible overrides the position of the components in the subassembly. When I turn Flexible off, the pneumatic cylinder returns to its original length and the constraint fails. The cylinder assembly controls the length when it's rigid, which makes sense because you can't have it fixed at a different length in each assembly. This means that once you make a subassembly flexible, you shouldn't make it rigid again unless the rest of the assembly components are free to move or any other constraint values are compatible.